And in terms of the theatre today, I did ask that, bearing in mind I was going to speak on national security, that I be draped with the 6 flags that occurs with every press conference that encompasses national security. Ordinarily there's only 2 flags, but national security, you'll notice in every press conference there are 6 flags. I think I've been strategically placed on the far left of the panel. But I want to say that there's actually some synergy between the position that I take and that of my comrades of the inner cabinet of the Liberal Party. I too had the benefit of a Irish Catholic education, and like many members of the inner cabinet of the Liberal Party, we believed in the reunification of Ireland and the expulsion of foreign troops. Fortunately, that debate took place in the 1970s, 80s and 90s before the Anglo-Irish Peace Accord, because had it taken place in the current environment, we would have all been charged with supporting or advocating terrorism. And the Prime Minister that we have today wouldn't be in that position. Joe Hockey, Christopher Pyne, Scott Morrison, they would have all been prohibited from participating in public life. So it's interesting the way the sands might shift. I, of course, am tainted, like perhaps some of you here today, because I supported the abolition of the apartheid regime and the emergence of the ANC in South Africa. I supported the Kosovars in their struggle for independence. I support the Kurdish people in their claim for autonomy, the 40 million Kurdish people in their claim for autonomy. And I support the West Papuans in their struggle for independence from Indonesia. If I advocated that, of course I might be in trouble under the current regime. And it's the cases really that illustrate how dangerous these anti-terrorism laws have been. And we are caught up really in a propaganda campaign that I think is frightening. I'm acting for the 2 most recent suspects in terrorism investigations. The person who was arrested for the so-called Mother's Day massacre, that's a slogan that's been promoted by the Herald Sun. And of course I'm acting for the other person, one of the persons who's been charged with the so-called Anzac Day massacre. And when the truth comes out in both of those matters, you might see something of a different picture than what's been promoted in the press. But fortuitously, in the last budget, counter-terrorism has increased in its funding to the tune of $450 million. So we ought to feel a bit safer in the budgetary allowances that have been given to counter-terrorism. If you ever go to Canberra, by the way, just make sure you go and look at the new ASIO building. It's a building that I don't think now is described as fit for purpose, because there's some design defects that allows surveillance of that building by foreign agencies. But it's the single biggest construction in Canberra actually in the post-war period. So have a look at the money that's been spent there. There's been a tenfold increase in funding post 9/11. It's the terrorism laws that David will know more than anyone that have allowed for a creep into other aspects of conventional society. We know, for instance, in the building and construction industry, the ABCC now have powers to interrogate people in secret in relation to industrial disputation in the building and construction industry. And if you refuse to answer questions, this is legislation that mirrors the ASIO interrogation provisions. You can be subject to a term of imprisonment of up to 6 months, albeit the fact that you've committed no crime and you've simply engaged in some sort of industrial disputation. But it now extends beyond the ABCC. It extends to the Fair Work Commission, the ACCC, the Australian Consumer Competition Commission. They all have now adapted powers from counter-terrorism that involves firstly interrogation of people in industry who've committed no crime, who are not suspected of any crime. Jack Thomas was the Islamic convert, grew up in Williamstown, mother a nurse, father a teacher in TAFE, Williamstown Technical School. And Jack Thomas had gone to Afghanistan for the purposes of the call for the reconstruction of that country after the expulsion of the Russians. And of course he was caught up in a training camp in Kandahar. When 9/11 occurred, he fled Afghanistan together with the other 20,000 foreign nationals that were in Kandahar at the time. And he was intercepted coming back to Australia on a false visa at Karachi Airport in Pakistan in January of 2003. By that time, the first suite of anti-terrorism laws had been passed, and because they didn't have retrospectivity, Jack Thomas couldn't be charged for any of the activities he'd been engaged in Afghanistan, but he could be charged with receiving support from a terrorist organisation or a person associated with a terrorist organisation. And the basis on which he was charged was that he'd received his passage back to Australia. And of course, when he arrived in Australia, and he only arrived back in Australia with the assistance of all organisations, the ABC. Nick Mackenzie, who was a young journalist at the ABC at the time, we'd known, of course, that Jack Thomas had been held in detention for a period of about 6 months at that point. And it was Nick Mackenzie that literally on the AM program rang the foreign minister or the Home Secretary in Pakistan and said, "You've got an Australian citizen there, why hasn't that person been returned to Australia?" And the Home Secretary said, "Well, we've tried to return him, but the Australian government don't want him back." And all the overtures that had been made to Alexander Downer at the time and other ministers, Peter Reith and other people within the government at the time, all showed that they were completely disinterested in his return. Ultimately, however, because of public agitation at the time, he arrives back in Australia. He's reunited with his family, June 2003, and then on his return here, he's interrogated by ASIO officials. I can tell you this now, it would have been an offence if I told you at the time, but interrogated by Australian intelligence officials about his movements in Afghanistan. He complies with all the various requests made of him. And then dramatically in November 2004, of course, he's arrested. And those of you who remember the headlines at the time that replete with descriptions such as Osama bin Laden's white boy in Australia arrested in Melbourne. There were maps on the front page of The Age showing his movements from Melbourne to Kandahar, to Karachi and then back to Melbourne. And the theatre then began. It was said that Jack Thomas was a sleeper cell waiting to be activated on his return to Melbourne. And of course, on his return, he worked, in fact, ultimately in 3 jobs. He'd bought a very modest house in the back blocks of Werribee. He and his wife had had another child. The authorities, of course, said that was an indication of how sinister this person was. He was lulling everyone into a false sense of security. Of course, they were waiting for him to be activated. 6 months had elapsed. He hadn't been activated. Military institutions were safe. They waited for another 12 months. No activation of Jack Thomas as the sleeper cell. And then in November 2014, dramatically arrested, curiously, with commercial news crews in tow with the Australian Federal Police to film his arrest and the execution of a warrant at his mother's home in Williamstown. Of course, the authorities said at the time he was so effective as a sleeper cell and he had lulled everyone into such a false sense of security that he was about to be activated, so we better arrest 15 months after his return. And then at the bail application for Jack Thomas, the authorities said Al-Qaeda is a well-resourced organisation, and we expect that there may well be a helicopter escape bid from the Acacia unit at Barwon Prison. No one had ever escaped from Acacia. It's a prison within the prison confines at Barwon Prison. But the damage really had been done at that point. The theatre that had been created, helicopters hovering over the Supreme Court, sniffer dogs, members of the Australian Federal Police in flak jackets, all electronic devices confiscated because we'd had Osama bin Laden's white boy, who'd been a convert to Islam, who'd returned here after 9/11, fearing what would happen to any foreign national who was caught in Afghanistan. And of course we know what happened to the hundreds of people who were taken to Guantanamo Bay, including David Hicks and Mamdouh Habib. And really, it was that case that caused me to be somewhat cynical about the role of authority. And then things progressed. Of course, he's ultimately exonerated. The trial process takes 5 years. He's had 2 serious breakdowns in prison, shackled, manacled, solitary confinement, not permitted to speak to his family during the period of his initial remand. And so he's the first person arrested. And then the process really begins. We've got a suite of serious counter-terrorism legislation. We've spent billions of dollars on it. We've committed ourselves to intervention in both Iraq and Afghanistan. And it'll be for other people to judge whether that intervention has caused us to be placed at greater risk internally or domestically. Then we have the arrest, for instance, of the Ben Breaker Group in November 2005. The Ben Breaker Group, homegrown jihadist, who'd been infiltrated by a federal police officer, said that there are iconic landmarks that had been identified and targeted, and you will all remember, I'm certain, that one of the targets that had been identified was the MCG, and the plot to blow up the MCG on grand final day. As it transpired, of course, there was no charges that arose from that so-called plot. That arose out of a discussion between Ben Breaker and one of the suspects, in which they talked about the killing of innocent civilians in Iraq, and would it be permissible to kill innocent civilians in Australia, such as the blowing up of the MCG. That was the plot, that discussion. No chemicals, no weapons, no specific plan, but the damage, of course, had been done. Flinders Street was another iconic landmark that had said to be identified. Now, those people were in custody for 3 years. A third of them were completely acquitted. Another half of them were acquitted of other charges, including possession of the thing, and the thing was the jihadist literature that they had. But they were convicted on the basis of being members of their own self-proclaimed jihadist group under the self-styled leader of Nasser Ben Breaker. 3 years in solitary confinement, effectively, at Barwon Prison, other than for the last portion of the trial. For logistical purposes, it was impossible for them to travel from Barwon Prison to Melbourne Court every day. They're just some examples. The Tamil Tigers, what happens when every person is charged with a terrorist offence, there are orchestrated press conferences where it is always said that an imminent terrorist attack has been thwarted. Whether that's actually ever borne out by the facts ultimately, it's meaningless, because everyone simply remembers the press conference and remembers that an attack's been thwarted and we've all been saved. There have been no terrorist attacks in Victoria, and I think David might correct me here, but the one terrorist attack that occurred was at the Hilton Hotel in the 1970s, where the Federal Police had exploded a bomb. I'm not sure. Beg pardon? The Ananda Marga sect. A person by the name of Anderson had been wrongly convicted, spent 10 years in prison, where he was ultimately pardoned. So you need to be cautious every time there is a press conference in which it says you've been saved. I don't know what's going to come out of the Mother's Day massacre case for the 17-year-old child making a pipe bomb that was exploded in the park, other than to say this: the pipe bomb that was exploded contained match heads that had been ground up and sparklers that had been bought at a supermarket. Now, it may be more sinister, but we know that boy had been monitored over a period of weeks. Hadn't been arrested on as a result of behaviour on one day, had been monitored over a period of time. No interruption to him. No one saying, listen, you are going off the rails here. We better get your parents who live a conventional lifestyle. Father's a medical practitioner. No interruption to them. They allowed the thing to run. And similarly with the so-called Anzac Day massacre, as we now know, one of the accused was talking to a 14-year-old boy in England, and that chatter had been monitored. He'd been going to the graveside of his friend who'd been killed by police in a tragic set of circumstances at Endeavour Hills. And I say nothing of the police's conduct. They may have, of course, legitimately having to take the action that they did to cause a further catastrophic event in terms of injuries that they'd sustained. But they knew that those two boys were very close, were in the company of Newman Hayter, the boy that had been killed, and they'd been monitoring them. They didn't interrupt them at any stage. They allowed them to run. And then, of course, dramatically, just before Anzac Day, the 100th commemoration of great significance to the Australian community, they arrest them. One of them's placed on an interim preventative detention order. The main person is charged and remanded into custody. And the second boy, who's more peripherally involved, who's not part of the chatter that goes on the internet, he's placed on an interim preventative detention order. First time that legislation's been used in 10 years, in which there'd been a campaign to have that legislation repealed because it simply had no use. I know these things must have been decided months in advance, but within a week or two, the budget announcement, there's a further $450 million to counter intelligence or counter-terrorism. There is, of course, bipartisan support for all of these measures, and I just think we need to cast a bit more of a critical eye over what actually happens as opposed to what we hear in dramatic circumstances. I knew the Mother's Day massacre raid was about to take place because I got a phone call from a Herald Sun journalist at 2 o'clock that afternoon telling me that the event was about to go down. They'd all been alerted so that they could be in position to film the whole episode. Now, if it's truly an incident of national security, you think you'd alert the commercial newspapers and media interest? I don't think so. I'm not going to say be alarmed. Be cautious, and be cautious not just, as I said, in terms of what we know of these various events, but be cautious about how the net has been cast much more widely in relation to counter-terrorism and the adaptation of those laws to our other aspects of our justice system and our daily lives. Thank you.